So in part 3, we'll talk about types of measures. So we have a lot of ways we can measure variables, and self-report measures is probably the one you're most familiar with. We measure any variable, but particularly dependent variables, by asking people to report on their own feelings, beliefs, experiences, moods, and so forth through valid and reliable scales or inventories. We have behavioral measures. We observe behaviors of a participant in a natural or a lab setting. We have physiological measures, measuring dependent variables by gathering some sort of bodily information. We'll look at a few examples shortly, like cortisol levels or heart rate variability. And there are other measures that we'll talk about, including unobtrusive measures, task or proxy measures, and knowledgeable informants. So let's take a look at these self-report measures that we all know so much about. So we ask people to report on their own, what they perceive as their own thoughts, feelings, and actions. So for example, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale asks people to respond to items indicating their own level of self-esteem. We're going to look at this one in a minute. Depression, we measure it through the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a valid, reliable measure that gauges the level of depression. Narcissism, which is a trait of self-involvement or self-focus, and we have a personality inventory that measures it, that we'll look at in a moment. So the pros of this sort of thing is that they're quick, they're easy to administer, and there's really good inter-rater reliability, which we'll talk about on the next lecture. That means that anyone who rates them will get the same results because it's an objective test. There's no subjective judgment. No one's interpreting the result. The data are providing the information. And so if we have a valid scale, if you have a construct that a previous researcher has validated, this is an excellent option. But the cons is they're only as good as the responses produced, and that may be limited, like they're limited by what a respondent chooses to share. So some things a respondent might want to keep private, or even what a respondent is aware of. Someone might not realize, for example, that they're feeling angry, but they are, and the care taken by the respondent. So they might rush through it and not take care in their responses, or they might have what we call response sets and certain patterns of responses that nevertheless aren't really accurate. And these only tap the cognitive level of understanding. So here is the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. It's just the first, I just snapped a picture of the first part of it, and you can see what the items are like. They're really short, simple statements. On the whole, I am satisfied with myself. At times, I think I am no good at all. And then individuals are asked to strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And so this is a measure of self-esteem. It's a 4-point, meaning there's no neutral point in the middle. Personally, I prefer this when I'm giving a scale, and when I'm taking a scale, it drives me crazy because sometimes I can feel both ways about something. But it does push respondents to either, go one direction or the other, even if just a little bit. This particular scale is valid and reliable, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture. This is the Beck Depression Inventory. You can see that this is also a 4-point scale, so it's a Likert scale, meaning that we're going to associate these numbers with these values. But in this one, instead of just agree, disagree kinds of continuum, we have I do not feel sad, I feel sad all the time and I can't snap out of it. I am so sad and unhappy that I can't stand it. And so you can see this rates the intensity of the emotion, negative emotion a person is feeling. Second item, 0 points if a person says, I am not particularly discouraged about the future. Or 1 point, I feel discouraged about the future. Or 2, I feel have nothing to look forward to. Or 3, I feel that the future is hopeless and that things cannot improve. And this is such a meaningful scale because it captures this gradation of depression, which is a subtle feeling. It doesn't get at the cause of depression. It doesn't get at the nature of whether someone is, say, sleeping all the time or feeling so agitated they can't sleep at all. It doesn't tease out those things, but at least we identify through the scale the severity of the experience someone is having. And this, again, is a valid, reliable scale. If you are interested in depression as your own dependent variable, this is probably the way you would measure it. Then we have a narcissism personality inventory. It's a little different. It's what we call a forced choice scale, because a person has pairs of statements and they have to choose one. For example, the first pair, I have a natural talent for influencing people, versus I am not good at influencing people. Or the next pair, modesty doesn't become me, or I am essentially a modest person. In this example, this word become means like flatters me. Modesty doesn't become me. It's not me. It's not a part of me. And the next pair, I would do almost anything on a dare, versus I tend to be a fairly cautious person. And so this is another way of measuring a trait, in this case of interest. And this is also a valid, reliable scale. The researcher did the work on this scale. And then this last example, we have the Zodiac Signs Personality Test, and 49 questions, 29 minutes. And it has questions like these. I make it a point to try a new restaurant dish or hangout. And then the response options are yes, I do that often, sometimes, but not too much, or no, I rarely do that. I am good at coming up with creative solutions to problems. I'm the type of person who thinks outside the box. I use everyday objects in a creative, practical way. And so you can see the types of items on this scale. Now, this scale is not yet established as valid and not yet established as reliable. So I don't know if these researchers are in the process of doing the work or if they are just sort of exploring these ideas. But there's a lot of work that comes into establishing a scale as valid and reliable. And so when you do your own work and you find your dependent variable, you'll be wanting to look for one, hopefully, where someone else has already done the work. The second way we can measure our dependent variable, or any variable, is through physiological measures. The body has its own secrets to reveal. We can measure physiological indicators to learn about psychological states. So, for example, we can measure stress through a swab of saliva. And cortisol is a hormone produced in the pancreas that rises when a person is experiencing stress. We can measure resiliency by, I don't have an image here, but something called heart rate variability, the extent to which your heart rate rises and falls in response to stimuli. We can measure general, emotional arousal through skin conductance, which just measures how much energy is being transmitted through your body, especially at the farthest extremities here. And all of these are indicators of psychological states, and the pros are, they're kind of nice. They provide excellent objective data. It's not overlaid with thoughts, like you can't think yourself out of producing cortisol. If you're stressed, your body's going to produce it. Your beliefs aren't going to interfere with it, or if you want to keep it secret, your body might still reveal the secrets. Smartphones make this even increasingly possible because a lot of health data can be recorded through a person's smartphone. The cons are that it's not always clear what they represent. For example, they used to believe that skin conductance was sort of a lie detector test, and that proved not to be the case. They couldn't make a strong relationship between the arousal that someone feels when answering questions and whether or not they were being truthful. Like someone might be anxious answering questions even if they're telling the truth, or they might be calm answering questions even if they're lying. Secondly, physiological features change over time and over the course of a day. Like cortisol levels change naturally over the course of a day, so we have to take that into account. We need to take baseline data in. Individuals vary in their physiological characteristics, and we might need special training or lab assistance in order to evaluate the data. The third method is behavioral measures. Behavioral measures specify behaviors of a participant through different types of observation. So we can observe behaviors naturalistically. In a natural setting, like observing the size of children's playgroups at recess from a hidden vantage point. So we have someone who's watching the recess, documenting certain information, but they're not participating. Another example, engagement. Maybe someone watching a classroom counts the number of times a specific behavior occurs, such as the number of times a student looks away from the teacher or task. And then we have participant observation, which is observing behaviors while at the same time participating. So let's say we have the variable emotion regulation and we're interested in measuring it for a particular child. In this case, the teacher might document a child's emotional outbursts while she teaches. So she would be teaching and then she would notice, oh, this child is having an outburst, and she would document it. Or laboratory observation. And when we say lab, we really don't mean it's necessarily like in an office with test tubes. We just mean that it's a controlled setting, that we have controlled a setting so that certain stimuli are going to be present, and then we'll observe their behavior under those stimuli. So an example is the strange situation task, which is used to measure attachment. We'll look at that more in a minute. And so we're observing infants' reactions when they're separated for a brief period from their mothers. So here's an example, naturalistic observation. A lot of our early research in behavioral research looked at primates, and the researcher can never be a part of the primate group. And so she or he would just sit and observe what she saw and take notes, but she was never a part of the group. And so certainly that's done with these naturalistic environments for animals, but it's also done for humans if we are just, making note of, as the example I gave earlier, of the recess behavior. This little image clarifies participant observation versus naturalistic observation. And so the difference is, in this case, the participants that she's observing are all around her and she's a part of the group. Whereas naturalistic observation, the researcher is outside the group and they're within the circle and he's outside, maybe even invisible. The definition: we are observing overt behaviors, gestures, or facial expressions of a person or people who may or may not be aware that they're being observed. So such measures have to be clearly defined. We have to know exactly what we are observing. In the case of this very formative observation in the primate studies, probably she doesn't know what she's observing right away. She's making notes, but the more she makes notes, the more she knows what she should be observing. In the bottom example, it's very likely that this researcher is looking for something particular and he's been trained. And as I just said, the observers need to be trained to recognize what is to be observed consistently. It's usually a long training process in which all the different people who will be rating are watching the same videos and taught to converge, taught to rate different videos, more and more and more videos, until all of the raters are seeing the same things. And there is potential bias. If the observer knows the hypothesis, then his observations might be biased. So it's important for, I use this word blinding that I haven't introduced yet, but all it means is that the researcher doesn't know what the conditions are. So if this researcher is observing these children and looking for certain, say, aggressive behavior, and there are two conditions, maybe one condition there's aggressive music playing, and the other condition there's a different kind of music playing. If this researcher knows the hypothesis, then it might be that he kind of distorts his observations. So we might say we have some challenges with this kind of data. So an example of lab observation is the strange situation task, and it's used to identify attachment styles of infants. We all as humans have an attachment style according to a framework put together by researchers who developed both different attachment styles and then did subsequent research to show that these carry through into adulthood. And the test that has been developed by Margaret Ainsworth to test this is called the strange situation task. And I'm not sure if you can see it here, but we basically have a researcher and a mother or a parent and a child, usually around 1 or 2 years of age, and a bunch of toys. And there's a lab set up, and there's a mirror here that's an observation window, and the door. And so this is the setup, and then in various stages, after a certain precise time increments, a stranger will come in, the mother will leave, the mother will come back, and various things happen. But throughout all of that, this window is open and people are documenting what the child's experience is in that. And so there again, we have to make sure that what they're documenting is objectively, well, we'll say reliable, even though we haven't introduced that term yet. So we have some other measures, some really nice creative measures. Scientists are always trying to find different ways of measuring particular constructs to get the most valid and reliable measures. So we might have task measures, or we could call them proxy measures. We could observe participants completing a prearranged task that represents a dependent variable. And here are some examples. For memory, we might ask participants to complete a predefined task, like the backward digit span task. And this is a validated test, and the way people perform on it is indicative of certain characteristics of memory. It's validated. Prosocial behavior. We could watch to see whether people stop to help a person in need who's laying on the side of a sidewalk. Or we could watch to see whether participants help someone pick up a stack of papers. Aggression. We could, instead of asking people how aggressive they feel, we could observe. We could put them in a situation where they're allowed to put really, really a lot of hot spice into a drink that they ostensibly can make their opponent taste, and we can use how much spice they put in as a measure of aggression. So next, unobtrusive measures. We can observe something in the environment to determine the extent to which a behavior occurred. I'll have another example of this, but here's a simple example: hand washing. If we want to know how much hand washing occurs, that's good hand washing, we could measure the volume of soap used in a school restroom to determine whether students wash their hands appropriately. And then finally, knowledgeable informants. We could ask others who know a participant well, like a family member or a very dear friend, to complete a scale on that person with their permission. So we would invite someone to participate in a study, and we'd say, at the end, we'll ask you to complete this scale, this self-report scale, and we'd also like you to give us the names of 2 people who are very close to you, who could also complete the scale. That's the way that would work. An example of these proxy measures or task measures. So this would be measuring our dependent variable in a subtle way to supplement or replace self-report. We know the limits of self-report, those personality or inventories or scales that people take, and so these proxy or task measures can supplement that. So they're beneficial because they're helpful where people may not be inclined to or able to report their own behavior honestly. So if we think people might not be honest, then getting them a task would be good. Similarly, physiological measures might be good. Often a behavior is defined that serves as a proxy measure for the variable of interest. So we're looking at a behavior instead of just the emotion, especially if the behavior of interest might be harmful. So if we're interested in aggression, well, we don't really want to encourage someone to be aggressive in real life and to cause harm to someone else. So we set up a situation where they can act aggressively, but no harm occurs. An example, let's imagine this hypothesis. People who believe they will be loved later in life. So they in this situation, they take a personality inventory, and then someone comes in and tells them the results of this inventory show that you will be loved later in your life. Or it tells them, oh, the results of this inventory show that it's likely you're going to be alone late in life. So will people who are told different things, you're going to be alone later in life or you're going to be loved later in life, will they be more helpful to a stranger? Well, how are we going to measure this helpfulness? Well, let's do it this way. Let's measure it unobtrusively by having a stranger drop a stack of papers just as the subject is exiting the room after they got their test result that said there's going to be alone or they're going to be loved. And then we'll measure the extent or the time that that person helps the person with a stack of papers. Second example, people who have been primed with old age cues will walk more slowly than people who have been primed with youth cues. So priming just means you have a brief exposure to something that makes you think about old age, or you have a brief exposure to something that makes you think about youth. And so how are we going to measure whether whether it affects them? We're going to measure their walking speed. So after they leave the room where they were primed with old age or with youth, we'll measure the number of seconds to walk from the lab room to another room down the hallway. Finally, people who have been rejected will behave more aggressively than people who have not been rejected. And how will we measure aggression? We're going to measure the length and duration of a sound blast emitted to an opponent in a different location. Now, the opponent is never going to get blasted. No one's going to get hurt in this experiment. But how hard do they blast that horn? How long do they hold the blast? That can indicate aggression, and that might be, in this hypothesis, a consequence of being rejected. Unobtrusive measures are even more subtle than these proxy measures, which might also be considered to be unobtrusive. So here's an example. In a museum, measuring the frequency of floor tile replacement. This can help determine the level of popularity on the galleries among visitors. So if we have certain floor tiles that are worn out faster, it might mean that more people are there. A less popular gallery with collections that visitors don't like, these floor tiles could be as good as new. But a popular gallery with collections that attract a lot of visitors, the floor tiles wear out faster and they have to be replaced. So, unobtrusive, you're measuring your dependent variable in a secret way on topics where self-report might not be accurate or might be not possible. So that just restates what I just said. Very often these are physical. We use physical evidence as an indicator of behavior, like counting alcohol bottles in the trash to determine alcohol use or something like that. There are, depending on how it's done, there might be ethical problems in that people might feel spied upon. And so we'd have to be aware and respectful of the people that we're interested in. I don't think that this might make people feel spied upon, but the alcohol bottles might.